Good morning and welcome to the fourth meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for 2025. The first item on the agenda is a decision on taking items 3 and 4 in private. Item 3 is consideration of the evidence we will have heard on the Land Reform Scotland Bill, and item 4 is consideration of the committee's work programme. Are we agreed to take these items in private? We are agreed. Our second item of business then is an evidence session on the Land Reform Scotland Bill, and today we'll hear from landowners, including community landowners, on part 1 of the bill. And I welcome, before I welcome, I'm actually going to make a declaration of interest, and that's just to remind everyone that I have an interest in a farming partnership in Moray as set out in my register of interest. Specifically, I declare as an owner of approximately 500 acres of farmed land, of which about 50 acres is woodland. I also declare I'm a tenant of approximately 500 acres in Moray under a non-agricultural tenancy, and that I have another farming tenancy under the Agricultural Holdings Scotland Act 1991. I also declare that I sometimes take on grass lets on an annual basis. And I probably should make it clear that having been a surveyor in Inverness for about 14 years, I've come across two of the witnesses before, Andrew Had and Tim Kirkwood. I think in Tim's case, sitting on the opposite side of the table at various negotiations. So I'd like to welcome to the committee, first of all, Laura Hamlet, the Chief Executive of Koyak Community Development Company, Andrew Howard, the Managing Director of Moray Estates, Tim Kirkwood, the Chief Executive of Wildland, Megan McGuinness, Local Development Manager for the Applecross Community Company, and where are we now? Yes, Danny On, the Director and Chair of Colonsea Community Development Company, and Dennis Overton, the Chair of Ardtornish. And I'd also like to welcome Rhoda Grant, who is sitting in, and we'll get some questions at the end. So thank you all for attending, whether it virtually or online, and I'm just going to start off with the easy question at the beginning, which hopefully you can give me simple answers, and I'm just going to work along the table and then down onto the screen in front of me. Andrew, could you just set the scene a wee bit about what your interests or how you're involved in interests in land? Briefly, I don't need the whole chapter.
Yeah, certainly, Chairman. Well, I'm the Managing Director of Moray Estates. It's a large, diversified land holding owned by the Earl of Moray and his family. We farm, we have forestry, let property, but we've also got significant renewable energy and development interests, including the new town of Tornagrain, which will eventually be 5,000 homes between Inverness and Nairn.
Roughly how many hectares are you?
About 16,000.
Okay, thank you. Tim.
I'm, Chief Executive of Wildland Estates. Wildland is a company which has a number of subsidiary companies, 11 different companies, which are all land-owning companies. A historic situation because the estates, which now comprise 3 significant contiguous blocks of land, were bought separately and amalgamated, and each came either already bundled within the existing company or was bought through a separate company. So Wildland effectively is 3 significant blocks of land, the 2 principal ones being Wildland Cairngorm, based in the Cairngorms, and the next one, Wildland Sutherland, based on the north coast of Scotland. Slightly different topographies and ecosystems, but both very extensive areas of ground. We also have a block of ground in Loch Arborough at Bray Roy, which contains some significant commercial forestry interests, and Aldari Castle on Loch Ness. Overall, it's about 100,000 hectares of land, principally being managed in the large remote areas for nature conservation and natural outcomes. We employ about 106 people at peak. We've got a hospitality business that we're growing. We've got a little bit of in-hand farming, some grasslets, and native and commercial woodland.
Okay, thank you very much. Danny.
Hi. We are I'm the chair of the Community Development Company, effectively the Development Trust for Colonsay. We are relatively new and small-scale landowners. Colonsay is about 4,000 hectares. 80% of it is in single private ownership. We ourselves own less than 100 hectares, mostly croft land, but some small development sites, including new housing development and business units.
Thank you. Dennis.
Good morning. I'm chair of Ardtornish. Ardtornish is a land-based business on the peninsula of Morven. Morven's about 2.5 times the size of Greater Glasgow and has a population of about 350 people. Ardtornish extends to 8,300 hectares, and what we're seeking to do at Ardtornish is develop and build a sustainable business long-term in its thinking. The ownership of Ardtornish for the last 95 years has been in the family, the Raven family, and we're now moving into 4th generation involvement there.
Thank you very much. Laura, you're next.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Laura Hamlet and I'm the Chief Executive of the Coyock Community Development Company. So we are in the far northwest and we're actually part of a regional land use partnership with Wildlands in Sutherland. So that's a connection there. There's about 250 people live in Coyock. Population density is 3.5 people per square kilometre, so it's quite sparsely populated. We're 2 hours from the nearest city hospital in Inverness and 40 minutes from the nearest village, that's Ullapool. The development company was set up to respond to an emerging housing crisis back in 2010, and since then, a team of volunteers worked to develop a wind turbine, the Varuna, and also in parallel to acquire land. So we acquired 3 acres of land in 2023 and we're building 10 housing units there. But last year, the major development that we had was that we were given a philanthropic donation to purchase the Bantabit estate, which was split as part of the sale. And the development company received the crofted portions of the estate. So that's around 3,000 hectares. It's 100% crofted, there's no freehold in it at all. And our major challenge there is to build a sense of community and foster collaboration so that we can work on management together with the grazings committees. To put it all in context, our school roll has dropped by 70% since 1996 and we're now down to 8 pupils. So that's our main focus, is tackling the depopulation crisis.
Thanks very much, Laura. And finally, we've got Megan. Do you want to come in?
Good morning, convener and members of the committee. Thanks for inviting me to give some evidence this morning. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I hope that you can hear me okay. I'm the manager of the Applecross Community Company, which is a community land owner and the only development trust on the Applecross Peninsula. The Applecross Community Company has been operational since 2008. It's set up to deliver a range of different community development and community benefit projects. We're also increasingly stepping in to deliver some of the basic public services in the area. We own a range of, we own about probably less than 20 hectares in total. We've focused on acquiring a number of different sites of what I guess we call sites of community significance, in which to focus our activities. So that includes owning the local filling station. We own a community broadband network. We own affordable housing, an allotment, community garden, community woodland. We recently bought a Church of Scotland church building, which we're converting into a community hub. And we're now focusing on a larger affordable housing and business unit project. And all of these projects are identified, are starting based on the starting point that they're identified as community needs through community consultation activities. We are the only development trust on the Applecross Peninsula. The wider area is a 26,000 hectare peninsula with about 260 people living on it. So similar kind of population density as Laura already mentioned. There are 14 crofting townships across the peninsula, and over 95% of the peninsula is owned by the Applecross Trust. So our key focus at the moment is stepping up to increasingly deliver public services that we see with the shrinking public sector in the Highland region, and also really a focus on providing affordable housing to, again, tackle the similar problems that Laura already mentioned in terms of declining school roll and overall declining population. Before I finish, Convener, if you don't mind, I would just like to ask the committee to note that I'm giving evidence today only on behalf of the Applecross Community Company, not on behalf of any previous roles I've had or in my capacity as a board member of Community Land Scotland, if the committee could note that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Megan. And of course, you would have to be asked. It's Applecross, one of my favourite stops on my summer surgery tours. And if you weren't here, I probably wouldn't be allowed back. So the first question is going to come from, I think Kevin's got an opener on that.
It's just a follow-up, Convener, and Mr Kirkwood said that wildland has some 100,000 hectares. Mr Howard said that Murray Estates has some 16,000 hectares. And yet, in terms of some of the research that has been done for the committee, it stated that wildland had in excess of 75,000 hectares and Murray Estates in excess of 12,500. So you've expressed that there is greater land holding than our researchers have managed to find. Do you think that you need to be a little bit more open and transparent about the land holdings of each of your individual entities? Mr Kirkwood first, please.
I don't know how we could be more transparent, and they're all owned in UK registered companies. We don't seek to mislead or conceal the extent of the land holdings at all. And I just explained how they fall. We've got about I tend to think in acres, to be honest, but there's some 100,000 acres up in Sutherland, which is an amalgamation of a number of estates which have been bought over a number of years. Similar area in the Cairngorms, a block of land in Loch Arbour, and about 500 acres at Loch Ness, which includes some of the Solent of Loch Ness. So I don't think there's any issues of transparency or trying to conceal the extent of the land holdings in any way.
Okay, thank you. Mr Howard?
Well, I'm not quite sure what the source of the information is. I mean, we state on our website, for instance, the size of our farming operations, the size of the land holding that we have let to other people, and the size of the woodland, the resource that we're managing as well. Now, obviously, I'll go away and check that those figures are accurate. It's perfectly possible that there are areas that aren't actively managed for forestry or farming, for instance, that we haven't included in the narrative on our website. Very happy to check that and correct it. But like wildland, we've no desire to be anything other than clear about what we own and where we own it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
I'd like to add, if your researchers want to contact me, I'd happily liaise with them.
I'm sure they will.
I think, in fairness, looking at the paperwork, the bit at Loch Arbour has probably been missed off, because it certainly talks about Loch Erebor, which is your northern bit, and it certainly talks about Glenfeshie. So
yes,
I think that may be the discrepancy there. Go to the Deputy Convener, Michael.
Good morning. I want to pick up an area around how you engage with local communities around your estate management planning and how you're going to use your land in the years ahead. Can you maybe give me a sense, if I turn to yourself, Mr Overton, around how you go about engaging with the local community and how you consult with them on any plans you have for developing management plans for your estate?
Yes. I think we've seen an evolution over the last 10 years from quite an informal process. I think that it existed for a long number of years on Morven in terms of this community communication interaction. First of all, we see ourselves as part of the Morven community. We're within it. There are over 35 people out of that 350 population, a part of the Ardtornish team. So we don't see these as two clearly distinct entities in terms of the way that we think. But about 10 years ago, we decided that we should take a more structured and a proactive approach to interactions with the community. And that was really informed by, I think, our own change in direction, strategic direction. And that was from moving from a traditionally mixed estate business to something much more focused. And I think we'd realised the need for ecological restoration about 10 years ago. That set us thinking about developing an ecological restoration plan, which is really the overarching driver. It's the overarching strategy for everything that is happening at Ardtornish. Has to be consistent with that. And so thinking about how to develop that plan and the involvement of the wider community of Morven, I think moved us into this more structured approach. So in developing that plan, discussions with people in the community, both through reaching out to people directly and asking for comment to documentation, was the way that we approached that. That's a 25-year plan, just to give you some sense of the period that we're looking at there, and we're now 7 or 8 years into that. Moving on from there, about 4 years ago, we thought we should start to consider reporting on our impact. So the impact of what happens at Ardtornish in the community, and that being economic impact, it being our environmental impact, also our social impact. What impact does what happened at Ardtornish have on the community, wider community of Morven? And some of the work that we've done in terms of building housing to seek to allow the population to grow, because Morven is too small. There are not enough people on Morven. So I think a social impact is relevant in that domain. And so that process of consultation and the opportunity for people to comment both formally and informally was built on what happened in the ERP work of 2016, 2017. And that process has continued. So a week on Saturday coming, we have an open session in the Village Hall in Lochalan to talk about biodiversity development and biodiversity recovery at Ardtornish, and we hope wider Morven. So we're going to be talking about things like red squirrels and wood ants. And that will be a busy meeting because people are interested, and it's very important, I think, that people understand what we are seeking to do, and that's informed by the views expressed by what's a very active and articulate community. So I think I'll stop there, but that hopefully gives you some flavour.
Okay, that's very helpful. Can I put the same question to Mr Howard?
I mean, our engagement with the various communities that are sort of close to or within the estate. The estate itself is over 8 blocks of land between Stirling, Murray and Inverness-shire, so we're not one big contiguous block. It is a constant process, and some of that will be informal. It might be with local community councils, it might be with local community development trusts, or even just individuals if they've got an area of interest. We don't consult with the communities, or didn't consult with the communities over the development of our corporate plan. That corporate plan contains lots of financial and other information that would be commercial in confidence in any case. That's the nature of the document. It wasn't designed to be a public-facing document. What we do is communicate with and engage with the communities over change, whether that be development, whether that be afforestation, or any change that is likely to have an impact on the local community. So at a relatively small and informal consultation, sort of end of the scale, would be consultation over new afforestation projects or things like long-term forest plans. And consultation with long-term forest plans is a requirement, but so we've been doing that for many years. I think it would be fair to say that the level of interest that we get in those is pretty small, despite efforts, and including last time having a public session allied to the development of the local place plan in one of the communities, and still there was relatively little interest because there wasn't any real change. It was just the next 10 years of forestry management. But at the other end of the scale, with a large project like Torna Grange, which obviously ultimately is going to be a town, that was a major public engagement exercise, probably one of the largest for a development of that type, which ran for 2 weeks, and the public and the local communities were completely engaged in the design of the town itself. So it was a sort of community-led design process. So our engagement strategy tends to depend on the nature of the issue that we're dealing with. So we're not engaging over things where there isn't change, but we are engaging where there's change, particularly if that's likely to have an impact on the community.
So can I just clarify, do you have a land management plan for all of the estates?
You
mentioned your corporate plan. I understand that as a business.
Yes.
But do you have for each of the estates, do you have a land management plan for them?
Well, if you like, the objectives for the management of that land will be set out in the corporate plan, but that corporate plan will also deal with things like our strategy for our farm tenanted estate, and for other aspects of the business. So it's not a land management plan per se, but it has land management objectives and targets within that plan.
You mentioned that you engage around change. From what you've said to me, it sounds like it's change that's initiated by the estate, not necessarily by change that the local community may be seeking. So can you just clarify how you go about engaging with the local community on looking at what their aspirations might be for how some of the land could be used for their benefit?
Well, sometimes that comes out of the informal process of engaging, because we're part of the community as well. So that might be contact with the local community council. It might be individuals just contacting us saying, we've got an idea, can we do this? It might be an allotment group, for instance, that say, can we have a site for allotments? Sometimes when we've engaged over development change, for instance, in one community we held a smaller engagement process than the Torna Grange process over options for the development of that community going forward, so that the community could be a part of that process. Now, that was several years ago. It was in advance of the local place plan process, but it was effectively trying to do the same thing. That engagement exercise also, if you like, flushed out a number of aspirations for the community, for land uses or other facilities that might be of interest to the community, which we were then able to act on. Okay.
Mr Kickward, can I put the original question to you as well on how you go about managing it from your estates?
Could you repeat the question for me?
Yeah, it's in essence, how do you go about engaging with the local community around how you're developing your management plan for the land that you own?
Okay. Well, to an extent, I think with Wildland, it's horses for courses. Wildland has been active in its management objectives and management of land in the Cairngorms much longer than it has up in Sutherland. Wildland was born in Glenfeshie some 20 years ago and took on an estate there. It was in the early stages of ecological restoration, which was a policy I think was relatively well understood at the time, but it was predicated largely on control of deer numbers, bringing deer numbers down to reduce the impact of herbivores on the environment, to allow the woodland and natural habitats associated with woodland to recover. And that at the time was a very, very contentious policy. It was pretty groundbreaking. I wasn't on the scene at the time, but was watching from the edges, and I think there was a general mistrust, misunderstanding, and a great deal of concern about the estates management practice at the time. It wasn't really well understood. The reduction in deer numbers was seen as potentially destroying rural employment, the effect on deer populations on neighbouring estates. I don't think there was a great deal of consultation or engagement at that time, and as a result, communities were split, misinformed, and deeply sceptical of what was going on. I think there was probably a lesson learned at that stage. It was good work being done for good reasons, but wasn't widely communicated or understood. I think the world's moved on a lot since then, and there's a happier and more receptive, wider audience understanding the importance of land management, managing for natural outcomes, particularly in the face of the climate crisis and the biodiversity collapse. So that there's a more interested and a more understanding, a more engaged community that we're embedded in, I think. We are a member of Cairngorm Connect in the Cairngorms, which is an amalgamation of like-minded landowners and with similar management aspirations. And that is effective over 6,000 square kilometres, I think. So this is land holdings of which Wildland is one, Forestry Land Scotland is another, the RSPB is another, and Nature Scot is another. So we got a charity, two public sector landowners and a private landowner, all working together in the interests of nature outcomes over a significant area of ground, long-term management objectives, hopefully some stability of ownership, and able to deliver these management policies at scale, consistency, and over time to give heritage outcomes and to allow nature processes to work at a natural speed in terms of landscape recovery. So in terms of community engagement there, Cairngorm Connect is well resourced. We help resource that through our own efforts and by funding our own part of it. It has public sector funding and grant aid coming in. It has a 200-year management plan which reflects what Wildland is doing. It engages widely and consistently on that plan, its objectives. It produces an annual report on how those objectives are being met or not, the impacts of that. There's a conference run annually for Cairngorm Connect where members of the public are invited to attend and hear what's going on through a way of consultation. We take feedback on the outcomes of the conference, take into account views that are taken there. There's a ranger service, partly funded by the Cairngorm National Park, who are involved in the initiative, who are outreaching continually. So there's a lot of public engagement going on now, of which we are part, around the objectives and management of the estates. As Andrew said earlier, we have a long-term forest plan, which involves extensive consultation with statutory stakeholders and others. If we're working on any kind of built development or land change use that requires planning, there's public consultation, of course, that's required with that. In the north, where we're newer on the block and not advanced and perhaps not so well understood, we've developed a community engagement plan which identifies land use change, the scale of it, the likely impact, and criteria on the basis of that as to how we engage and when we engage with the community to consult and engage over those propositions. We put that engagement plan in place through consultation with the Scottish Land Commission and their Community Engagement Facilitation Officer. Part of that was actually getting the community to engage with the Scottish Land Commission and their engagement officer to try and coalesce as a community with a single community voice that we could then engage with. Because we found that the community up there is quite partisan and there are different sections of the community with different interests and different objectives and different aims. And engaging with part of the community became problematic because other parts of the community felt that we weren't engaging with them. We thought we were engaging with a community group that would then pass on the engagement and ingather and communicate locally. And we had all sorts of problems there with our engagement being perceived as partisan and perhaps a degree of favouritism. So we got the Scottish Land Commission engaged with that. They went up and they visited the various community groups and representatives with an effort to find a way of engaging with us with a representative voice, if you like. And out of that came an initiative called the Community Conversation, which was convened by the local Community Development Trust, and all the various community members sent representatives. We represented, and we talked through a standing agenda periodically once a quarter to talk about what we're doing, what the community is doing, to try and find points of common interest and where we could work together. So we've had a number of initiatives. Like Dennis was saying, we're actually on the verge of instructing an impact assessment of what we're doing across the board, across very many measures. It's been scoped out, and we're about to appoint that to help measure our performance and our impact in terms of informing our future plans and how we engage going forwards. I'm sure we'll get on to local place plans, but we're very supportive of those. We've worked with HIE to try and bring that forward in the north, and we've even provided funding for a housing development officer to be engaged and to identify the priorities. So we work across many fronts. It's a two-way thing, community engagement. You have to have people on the other side who are willing to engage and bring their best to the process as well.
Okay, thanks. Can I move on to the issue of identifying communities' aspirations, their intentions, and how they... I will come to you, Mr. On, so, and how you then take that forward, having engaged with the local community around issues. Could I maybe turn to Megan McInnes and ask her, given their experience in Applecross, how you go about identifying communities' aspirations, their intentions, and then how you then take that forward?
Thank you, Deputy Convener. Yes, so although we are only a small landowner comparative to others in the Applecross area, consultation is really at consultation and then identifying, as you said, those aspiration and intentions and then working a way to take it forward is really the primary objective of the Applecross Community Company. It's really very much at the heart of what we do, and I think hopefully what I say will provide some contrast with some of the approaches that have been outlined by other people giving evidence this morning. So the Applecross Community Company, like many development trusts, is Land Reform Act compliant, which provides certain parameters on how we can operate in terms of our governance and the way in which we work with the local community. We are a very locally democratic organisation, and we are a member-led organisation. So our existence is based on our members. That's restricted to residents within this particular postcode. Our directors are elected from those members, and it's just the directors who are the ones who are ultimately liable in terms of our regulatory compliance and making sure that we are achieving our objectives. We are working towards, we're currently delivering a 5-year action plan that was based on substantive community consultation. We then worked with other partners in the area, including the Applecross Trust, to develop a community land use plan. which was the way of identifying land and assets within the Applecross Peninsula, which we could possibly consider looking to acquire, and in order to be able to develop our community benefit activities. And then following now that we're in the middle of the implementation of that 5-year action plan, we continue to regularly consult with particular parts of the community, or broadly with the community and other community bodies here, on the development of particular elements of that action plan. We'll be holding a drop-in session on Thursday this week to get feedback and ideas about developing business units alongside our new affordable housing project. We also have our mechanisms for regularly getting feedback and communicating with our members, with the local community, through the annual general meeting, the newsletters, and other things. So really, from our perspective, communication and transparency is really key. We don't always get it right, and we've learned to our detriment of what happens when we don't get it right, and we don't make sure that when we don't make sure that we're adequately aligned with community needs, aspirations, and concerns about a particular issue. But I think that there is because we are member-led, and because we have no objective other than responding to community needs and trying to deliver development objectives in response to those needs, there's a really very substantive difference in the way that a community development trust like the Applecross community works with its community and delivers for its communities in comparison to other types of land owner. And I think that from our perspective, there's a lot that can be learned from the community land owning sector more generally about that local member-led approach that could be useful for developing land management plans, local place plans, and other forms of community engagement and consultation in other parts of Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Owen, can I put the same question to you?
Yeah, and if I could pick up on the previous question as well, which kind of they roll together.
I think if you could do that briefly, that would be helpful.
Just to say, we are a very similar setup to Applecross. We perform the same role and in the same way, with the same kind of constitution. So we are community-led. In 2022, we published a 10-year community plan, which followed considerable and best practice engagement with the community. That was funded under a graduate placement scheme. We are currently in the process of engaging with the community on the carbon neutral islands, net zero plan and energy audit. We are producing an island profile, which again has been supported by Scottish Government Islands team. And we are about to embark on a local place plan. We engage with the community on we have a board meeting every month, and we issue a monthly bulletin to the community every month. We are fully engaged. I can give more detail if you wish. By contrast, we're very much in the dark as to what happens with the majority of the land on the island. Over 80% is in one ownership, and there are other private landowners, much smaller. And we have no idea of what's happening and no influence over plans for the majority of the island. One example is there was some talk last year of the main farming enterprise becoming organic and regenerative, I think is the other word used. This was mentioned to us as a development trust. It was also mentioned to one of the, I think it's a constable of the crofting community. But then we heard no more about it. I think it was possibly related to a grant application that wasn't successful. But we hear very little about what else is going on.
OK, that's very helpful. Thanks. Can I turn to Laura Hamlet and ask her the same question?
Yes, absolutely. So similar to Colonsay and Applecross with our governance and our constitution, our membership-led structure, over the period since 2010, there's been extensive and intensive consultation with the community in a whole raft of creative ways. One of our staff members is an artist, so you can imagine that we work on arts projects with the community to hear their views as well as the more traditional ways. All of this led to the work that we did with North West 2045 through the COVID lockdown period. So we had young people that were doing telephone and Zoom interviews with members of the community and going really deep diving into what their views were. We collated everything into a list of priorities, and in 2024 we went out to the community and did a more deep dive into what those priorities should be and asked them to set their top 5. So in addition to the 4 projects, the main 4 projects that we have in delivery, we've now got 5 projects that we believe the community are in consensus over that they want to see delivered. With regards to management plan for Baden Talbot Estate, because we only acquired the land last year in October, we don't have a plan yet. And we're using the time that we have just now to build trust with the grazings committees and the townships on the estate. The development company covers a much wider area than just the estate. And so we've got to be very careful that we're not seen to be taking the views of people who don't live on the estate and applying them to the people that do live on the estate. So there's very much a trust building exercise to be done at the moment. So we're currently setting up an estate business working group. We've taken advice from the Golson estate on Lewis, who've been doing this for a very long time. And the estate business working group, at the moment, it's proposed that it would operate with representatives from each of the grazings committees, but we're at a very, very early stage with that. We're just in discussions with each of the grazing committees to get their views on how the management of the estate should be conducted. We're hoping to have our first estate business meeting in the next couple of months. So we're at the very beginning of planning on how to manage the estate.
Thank you very much.
Now we're going to go to the next question. One of the problems, of course, with having a large panel is everyone wants to answer every question, which ain't going to be possible, I'm sorry to tell you. So if your view as you get on is the same as somebody else, don't feel you need to chirp in and say that and then give an explanation why it is. We'll take it as read. What we'd like is dissent to come forward if possible. And of course, that saves me then signalling to the gentleman on the right to cut off your microphone if you go on a long diatribe, which I've only done once as convener, hopefully never to do it again. So I would ask you to keep the answers short as much as possible. And the one thing that didn't come out of that is the costs of doing it. And I'm going to ask you that question at the end so you can think about the costs of doing community engagement. And I'm going to go to the next question from Monica.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everyone. So I want to stick with land management plans because the bill sets out what should be included in a land management plan, and that includes ownership structure, long-term vision and objectives, compliance with the Outdoor Access Code, Deer Management Code. There's quite a lot in there. But the part that I want to focus on this morning is that the land management plan would require the owner to set out how they intend to manage the land in a way that contributes to achieving net zero emissions, adapting to climate change and increasing or sustaining biodiversity. So I'm keen to hear, perhaps not from all of you in the interest of time, but please catch my eye. Interested to hear if you think that criteria and those duties are adequate and appropriate, or if there's something that you think is missing, or if you think that's too stringent. So I don't see any gesture. So Andrew, I've caught your eye. I might come to Laura if that's okay, but Andrew, would you like to respond?
I mean, they could be pretty big areas, particularly for diverse estates. We've got everything from upland moorland, not much of it, to commercial forestry and intensive agriculture, and then quite a lot of development activities. So a detailed assessment of the carbon emissions and everything else from the wide range of those activities would be quite a task. Now, that's a task we've started on, so our agricultural businesses have had their carbon audits. The forestry businesses' carbon audit would obviously look a lot more positive than that. The carbon audits, just to use one example of things like our development activities, would be really quite complex. So I think there's a risk that that management plans become, quite a big, onerous task. And if you're being asked to report on things which are statutory or other guidance requirements, then I'm not quite sure what the overall purpose of that is, because clearly we're required to comply, for instance, with the Outdoor Access Code, and we do. But I'm not quite sure why we would need to state that, because that's just something we're required to do. So, I would, if land management plans are introduced, then I think they need to be proportionate and deal with things that are going to be of material interest to communities. Now, just slightly I'm not trying to sort of wheel back to a previous question, but I think one of the benefits of the local place plans and why they're so important and should be supported more is that that's a community-led process in understanding aspirations and what they want to achieve and what information they would like to see. A land management plan is a landowner-led process, and I think, to be honest, if we're candid, there's a real risk that once the framework of what's supplied is set out, most landowners, to minimise the risk of creating a stick with which they could be beaten, will basically set out the minimum requirements of that land management plan so that they've complied, but that they haven't created rods for their own back at some point in the future by saying, well, we aspire to do this, which might be an ambitious aspiration, and then later they're, for all sorts of reasons, unable to meet those, perfectly genuine reasons, unable to meet those aspirations. So, you need to be very careful about big strategic objectives like resolving the biodiversity crisis, net zero, all that sort of thing, because they're at risk of being quite ill-defined things, and landowners are going to be a little bit cautious about setting out their stall if they've got any concerns that they're not going to be able to meet targets or other aspirations that they set out in those plans.
Thank you. That's quite a comprehensive answer, and I'm interested to hear more on what people think proportionate looks like and what would be good practice in that area. Just to maybe unpack some of that. So I take some of the points about, around net zero, biodiversity, climate change, but on a large estate, would this kind of assessment and planning not be happening anyway? You talked earlier on about the business planning side of it and the more commercial stuff that's perhaps not all in the public domain, but would that kind of work around thinking about, biodiversity, nature restoration, net zero, would that not be influencing the commercial side of it anyway?
Well, sometimes the two things can conflict. In sort of long-term sustainable terms, clearly we want our land holding to be in good environmental condition, because over the very long term that's clearly going to keep it in its maximum productive potential. But it's a lot of the nature regeneration or other, for instance, carbon compliance things will come with a short-term cost. And as a business, we've got to try and balance the pace at which we do that and when some of those activities take place. So it's complex, and we're learning, and we're perhaps not as far forward as we should be. So we're working our way through the sectors that we are involved in. So as I've already said, we've done the agricultural sort of carbon things. We haven't done a net biodiversity audit for any of our businesses yet, and that's likely to come. But we're also, having to balance the use of our resources between our commercial activities and all these other things, because in very simple terms, there's a limit to what we can do in any one given day, and this is a sort of new layer of activity and management sort of focus that didn't exist really 10 or 15 years ago. And if it's difficult to monetise, then we have to work out how we can bear that cost.
Okay, Dennis was gesturing, so I'll come to Dennis and then Laura. I don't know if you're keen to answer or not. I did put you on the spot, but I'll stick to the room just now. Dennis?
Thank you. Just a couple of points. I think the proposal to have LMPs as proposed in the bill, it's very important that there's a clear understanding about one size not fitting all, and the description that Andrew's just given is really describing a very, very different situation to our business on the other side of the country. So I think the need for flexibility and proportionality is important. And I noticed the Land Commission, in terms of its report last week on the bill, suggesting that the threshold dropped to 1,000 hectares for LMPs from 3,000 as proposed in the bill at the moment. So that's going to bring a lot more people, a lot more businesses into the LMP space, which I think means that this proportionality and flexibility is really important. Yesterday, the Land Commission had a workshop on this very topic, on land management plans, and we had somebody from the team there. And I think there's a danger of mission creep. So there was discussion about a percentage of spend locally in terms of economic data beginning to creep in to this, which in my mind is beginning to look quite different from the initial idea of giving a clear explanation to communities as to what a land business is doing, which I have no difficulty with that. So proportionality, I think, is really important, particularly if smaller businesses are going to be brought in, and just making sure that this breadth of what's being covered doesn't creep too far, and it does remain a land management plan.
Can I just clarify?
Monica, sorry, just before we go on, you said, just so I understand before we leave that, Monica continues her questioning, you said that the Land Commission had somebody in from the team. What team is that?
The Land Commission had a workshop yesterday on this topic of how to do land management plans well. So somebody from our team attended, and what they reported back was this element.
Sorry, no. I understand.
Yeah.
I thought it was there was clarification being given by the government on what they thought should be in a management plan. You're saying it's somebody from your team.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. It clarifies that. Thank you.
No, it's fascinating. We're here to learn in real time, and I mean, I suppose if I can just briefly follow up on that point, Dennis, because I don't know who was in the room, but one of the issues that we have sitting in committee rooms like this is we want to make sure that that legislation is fit for purpose, but also doesn't just exist in a silo. So the Scottish Government has other aspirations, and they have other legislation coming forward, including the Community Wealth Bill. So I don't know if that was touching on local spend going back into the economy so that the people who live in the area benefit from the investment and also any negative aspect around development. So was it in that kind of space around community wealth building, or? I
think it was, and I think in my mind it's bringing in a confusion so we spoke earlier about impact reporting, and that's important. And there's something about just this whole space of reporting that we need to think about, and planning. So the need to produce plans. So we have a local place plan being developed. We're contributing to the Morven local place plan that's being developed. So there's a question in my mind, what is the link between these LMPs and local place plans? And should they in some ways be more joined up? Farmers are having to produce plans as well in relation to what they plan to do in a way that hasn't been done before. So I think my plea to legislators would be aware of the danger of overloading communities, businesses with this planning process, and can we ensure that in the design the joined up approach is maximised?
That's very helpful. I'll come to Laura, and I think Danny waved if there's time, convener.
briefly.
Yes, Laura.
Thanks, Monica. Yes, I'd like to maybe contribute something as from the perspective of a landowner that works with crofters. We're reminded by the Crofting Commission that crofters have rights, and I think this creates a dichotomy between landowner and crofter. And to effectively manage a piece of land in the state, you're going to have to collaborate and work together. So as a landowner, we couldn't just produce a plan to, a net zero plan without the full cooperation and support and collaboration and just everything working together with the grazings committees, because there is no section of the estate that we own that isn't under crofting tenure. So I think it's just to be mindful that, we need to be able to work together. And I think at the moment there's maybe a false dichotomy between landowner and crofter when it comes to management, and it's not particularly helpful for a collaborative relationship to be setting up these dichotomies. And so if there is an opportunity to create the kind of environment where landowner and crofter can collaborate and not be at odds with each other, I think that would be really helpful. And ourselves, we've been approached by UHI, the University of Highlands and Islands, who are keen to work with us on the Baden Tarbert estate to produce a carbon audit and biodiversity audit, which we'd love to do, but we don't want to go in there with gung-ho without first speaking to all the grazings committees and making sure that everybody's on board with that.
Helpful, thank you, Laura. And it's good to get that kind of perspective at stage one. That will really help us with our reporting on this bill. I'll come to Danny and then I'll hand back to you, convener.
Thank you. Just a quite quick point. I hear words like minimal compliance and proportionate. The concern for me is that there has to be sufficient detail in a land management plan for the community to understand what it is and to challenge it. So it's not so much proportionality in terms of content, but one size won't fit all, obviously. On a small community like ours, it's something that can be done very quickly and easily, but we have to have the detail. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. Mark Ruskell, you've got the next questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to drill down a bit into the proposals that the Land Commission have made in relation to land management plans. So they've come up with two specific recommendations. One is that there should be a duty on the landowner to demonstrate how that community engagement has effectively informed the land management plan. And then their other proposal was to ensure there's a duty to refer to local place plans in the land management plans. So I wanted just to get your very quick reflections on both or either of those proposals. Are they useful? Would they, from your perspective, enhance the process of LMP development? I can see Megan's got a hand up, so go to Megan first.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted just to come on in this and maybe also respond to the more general question from Monica before that. I think the proposal from the Land Commission for this amendment in terms of the land management plans needing to demonstrate how community engagement has informed the land management plans is a really important recommendation. From our perspective, and living in a situation where there is concentrated land ownership, then we strongly agree with the introduction of land management plans and the transparency that we hope will come as a result. But there are some elements of the bill which we believe could be strengthened. Some are around the procedural ones, as you just mentioned, Mark. The land management plans would need to clearly discuss how community engagement had informed the management plan, how the plan had been changed as a result of that community engagement. Were it the Applecross Community Company developing a land management plan for our sites, which arguably we already do through our action plan and our community land use plan. A clear part of that for us is including a methodology on how we as a development trust have responded to community need. So I think making sure that the land management plans are really embedded in what the community need, as demonstrated through the community engagement, is really important. If I could just say a couple of things in relation to Monica's questions about the overall policy objectives. We support what is in the bill already, but we don't think it goes far enough. We think there needs to be a more explicit reference in the bill on the land management plan, needing to focus on achieving wider, contributing to wider government national targets as well as local objectives. So particularly in our area, sparsely populated areas, the land management plans should explain how they're contributing to tackling depopulation, improving access to affordable housing, promoting the rural economy, having more explicit reference to the land rights and responsibilities statement, what that means at a pragmatic basis, as well as increasing the bias ownership of land, the progressive realisation of human rights, and thinking also around community wealth building and other things. So I think that there could be a lot more detail provided in the land management plan about that. I just also, while I have the microphone, wanted to say a little bit about the question of proportionality, because it is really important. But we would agree, as Monica said, that landowners at the scale, if they are responsible, should already have long-term management plans for their land and for their assets. And I also just want to remind the committee that community development trusts and community landowners have to reach a substantially high bar in terms of their own business plans and demonstrating community support for the smallest asset if they are able to be successful in getting Scottish Land Fund funding, for example, for the acquisition of that asset. So from the perspective of the community land, from a community landowner, we don't think that what's in the land management plan is any more burdensome than what is expected of community landowners. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for those comments. I'm looking for others to come in. Andrew, actually, maybe in answering that, Andrew, I think you mentioned previous developments in the past, and I was aware that there's quite a lot of controversy around your Wood of Doon proposed development. I think you alluded to that earlier on. So, yeah, it'd be useful to hear your thoughts now, particularly on local place plans and how your thinking perhaps has evolved from that episode.
Yeah. I mean, I think as I hear some of the comments and we hear from other sort of witnesses about the scale of the ambitions for land management plans, I think the financial memorandum to the bill is underplaying quite significantly the potential cost for landowners. If you're going to run a proper public engagement exercise where the community is properly engaged, and that involves a process of helping the community develop a degree of understanding of the issues that you're dealing with, because some of the land uses might involve a sort of degree of technical understanding about why you're doing something or why you're proposing to do something to allow the community to engage properly in that process. These are major undertakings. Now, you've referenced the sort of small community charrette that we had in Doon about 12, 13 years ago, which was centred on one community. Now, I mean, that exercise cost about £70,000, and it ran for 2 or 3 days, and it involved the production of information afterwards. And it was controversial, and we responded to the feedback that we got from the local community. Now, this time round, what's happened is that the local community have produced their local place plan, which I think is absolutely the way that this should be being done, because that's a community-led process rather than something that the developer is doing. And critically, it's available to pretty much all communities. I mean, one of the things that's not really being talked about, I mean, even if you reduce the threshold to 1,000 hectares, the vast majority of communities and citizens in Scotland won't be affected by one of these land management plans. You know, so if the objective here is something that benefits communities, then all landowners should have to prepare one. And obviously it would need to be proportionate. It's irrational, illogical to have a threshold, because if it's important for one community, then it should be available to all communities, and land management plans won't be. But local place plans are, and they're a community-led process. So they're an excellent idea, but I think they could do with more support so that the communities themselves are in a better place to be able to advance those LPPs as effectively as possible and set out their aspirations.
So, I mean, you know, leaving aside your comment about the cost of engagement, following the logic of your argument, would that not actually save you money? Because instead of you having perhaps a more speculative housing development on an area green belt, you would have been able to say, well, actually, the community do or don't want this. Therefore, we've done all that consultation. We can then go straight into consulting on a land management plan that is driven largely by the local place plan and what the community wants. So I take the point that, you know, you did a sort of process, took, you know, £70,000 or a couple of days, eye-watering, but, you know, actually is what you're saying that the local place plan kind of sets the agenda and you feed off that, and that's a bit simpler.
Yeah, I think well, just dealing with the cost thing, it's a couple of days, but it's loads of work beforehand, and it's also a lot of work afterwards, reporting and responding to the feedback that you got and changing your original plans. You know, so it's a 2-day exercise with the community itself, but it's a whole process that runs up to that and after it. I don't wish to give the impression that that I'm averse to the idea of engaging and trying to understand what communities want. What I am averse to is excess bureaucracy over things that I don't think are going to really benefit communities. But what we should be focusing on, and the LPPs do this extremely well, is focusing on the change and the aspirations of communities themselves in and around their communities. Okay. And I think that's where the focus would be best placed.
Okay, thanks. Dennis, you want to come in?
Just
go back to these specific Land Commission proposals, if you could cover that as well. So,
just going back to your question on the specific, the second point that you raised about contact with or consultation with the community in terms and evidencing that in the development of the LMPs. It suggests a kind of episodic approach in terms of that relationship between the business and the community, which isn't really our experience. What we see is it's much more organic, and ideas and aspirations are being put on the table on a fairly regular basis, and we can see projects evolve. So specifically, as an example, the community decided or had an aspiration to place pontoons in the loch, a very attractive stopping spot for yachtsmen for 6 to 8 months of the year. So that's been a clear objective. It was possible to lease land very quickly and allow that development to continue. That conversation moves on to ownership and the possibility of the community owning that land, which we would be very open to. And so in our land management plan, that's reflected. It's in the LPP, but it's this process of ongoing consultation. The relationship is much more organic than episodic. So I don't view this as a kind of one-off process of consultation that will be happening once every 5 years, which is probably too short, actually. I think these land management plans should have a longer time perspective than that. Our experience is it's an ongoing conversation and understanding community ambition is something that we should be very well aware of, and vice versa. The community should understand the plans of the business to evolve and develop too.
So you see it really as a summation of the work that's
you're capturing
ongoing.
That process once every, whatever the period is for the updating of these LMPs.
Okay, I think we'll move on. Thank you.
Bob, you wanted to come in.
I think Mr Overton may just have addressed the point. It was Mr Howard quite challenging to hear some of the things you said, but important to hear it. So I just wanted to double check that good quality land management, irrespective of whether there's a statutory for a land management plan, and community engagement have an ongoing structure to engage with the community anyway, whether we were legislating or not. Is it making sure that land management plan fits in with those ongoing community structures for engagement, which I assume would be happening anyway. So I suppose, just Mr Howard, does that community engagement happen anyway, irrespective of whether we're legislating? Because that would be quite helpful to know.
Yes, I mean, it's vital. I mean, we're part of the local communities that are in or adjacent to the estate. And I won't repeat everything that I said earlier, but it will be with individuals, it will be with community councils, it will be with local councillors, it will be with local development trusts where they exist. It may be with informal groups of people. As Dennis has just said, it's a process that's sort of happening almost every day. And we try to make ourselves accessible. We have an estate office in Murray, we have an office at the Torna Gray Newtown development, we have an office at Doon as well. So our door's open and people know where we are. So it's a constant process.
Convener, I think that gives me reassurance. The other thing I would say that's not, it's not a question is that as a trustee of a local charity, I think we commissioned the charrette quite recently for around £28,000. So I'm happy to talk to you afterwards, Mr Howard, about how to drive best value into the charrette's process.
Briefly, Kevin.
Play devil's advocate, convener, because we know that sometimes good community engagement costs next to nothing, and when we hear of scenarios of charrettes costing £70,000, and I've been involved in charrettes myself over a number of years, some may argue that such a charrette is more about salesmanship in terms of selling the plan rather than listening to a community. I wonder if Mr Howard would want to respond to that, please.
Well, just dealing with the cost first, I think it depends on the scale and the complexity of the issues. So the Torna Grange charrette cost £500,000, but it was for a town of 5,000 homes. The Doon charrette, and it's largely driven by the amount of design information and things like that that you're going to provide to the community, was cheaper. And if you're doing something like a long-term forest plan or something much more informal, that cost might be down to a few hundreds of pounds. But to deal with your point specifically, what the community told us in Doon in 2010 was that they did not wish to see development in one particular site, and they did not wish to see development yet in another. So we honoured that and said we won't bring that site forward for development because we hear what you, the community, have said. And in the other site we said, well, we will come back to that at the next iteration of the local plan, which is what we'll do. So we definitely listened to what the community said, and as Mr Ruskell has said, they said it to us loud and clear, so it was a very helpful exercise in that point of view, and we responded directly to it.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Mr Chair, having sort of started delving into the area that I was going to ask on, which is cost. I mean, it's fine, Andrew and Tim, big land holdings, big bills, big consultation. But if this is dropped down to 1,000 hectares, it could be a small farmer coming up with a land management plan which would require the same engagement or the principles of the same engagement. So my question is, do either of you have a view on that, what that might cost somebody with 1,000 hectares if they had to produce a land management plan with proper consultation? And I'm assuming that we're working on surveyors' fees for drawing it up. So do you have an idea what they should put in the piggy bank in case it comes in?
I'm happy to have a go, and Tim can follow up. It depends where they are. So if their 1,000 hectares is in a sparsely populated area, so you've got a small community and their land use is relatively straightforward, so it might just, let's say it's a hill farm, then the range of issues that they're going to be reporting on is going to be quite narrow, and the engagement process is likely to be a lot simpler. So that's probably in the few thousands of pounds. And you're right, I think they would go to a firm of chartered surveyors to do it. So, but if you were talking about 1,000 hectares and it was adjacent to quite a busy community and they owned the land in and around the community, then I think the financial memorandum's estimate of anything up to £20,000 is probably not unreasonable if you want that engagement process to be a genuine one, rather than saying, here's our plan, what do you think, and then publishing it. So I think there's a real risk of underestimating the cost. But the key point is, if you've got 20 hectares, but it's all the land in a community, then that's probably more important to that community than 1,000 hectares 5 kilometres away.
So it's the local place plan that deals with it. Maybe without putting words in your mouth, you agree?
Yes.
Laura, do you want to just estimate the cost of your time and the board's time, in your case, for carrying out community consultation? Is it 90% of your time? Is it 50% of your time? And if so, what is the actual cost of that? And if you don't know the answer straight off, I'm happy to let you, Laura, and Megan come back, and Danny come back with a written answer to it. So you can do it on the hoof or think about it a bit.
I can certainly provide accurate figures later, but off the top of my head, our overheads are about 150,000 a year. And I would say that in terms of consultation, engagement is constant and ongoing. It involves people coming to us as well as us going to them. So maybe about 50% of our time is spent in engagement in some way. I did actually get a quote for doing an LLP, a local place plan last year, LPP, and that came in at just under £6,000 plus VAT. So.
Okay, that's helpful. Megan, do you want to consider it and come back, or are you happy to go? Yes. Danny, do you want to consider it and come back?
I'll come back, but just a quick point. We think we can do a local place plan in-house, which saves a considerable amount of money, having already done a community plan with transfer from one to the other. What would be really helpful is if there was a land management plan from the major landowners, so that we had something else to work with. So we'll obviously be engaging with them.
And I understand that, and my slight concern is that if you're talking about management plans, it could be that the landowner is producing a management plan for a tenant farmer and has no ability to respond in any shape or form to the requirements of the community. So it could be the entire 1,000 hectares is rented, and the community might have all sorts of aspirations, but the landowner's hands would be tied by the Agricultural Holdings Act. Right, on that note, I'm going to move back to Bob. I think you've got some further questions.
Thanks, Convener. I think one thing that's coming loud and clear, there's a quite helpful tension between making sure that land management plans are thorough, but they're also not burdensome. We can clearly see there's a use for them. Now, if they exist, of course, they should be complied with. So my question is about what we mean by complying with land management plans. So first of all, I suppose it's about who can report a breach of a land management plan. It's a rather narrow list at the moment, but the Land Commission, as you may be aware, suggested extending that to community councils, enterprise agencies, national park authorities and the Crofting Commission. Do witnesses think it would be helpful to have an extension along the lines suggested by the Land Commission? So, what the balance of views are on the panel. Maybe Mr. Kirkwood, maybe take you first.
Yeah, I think a key point here is if you extend the authority of those that can bring up a matter of breach. The question then, can they bring up the matter of breach without there being a complaint brought to them by a member of the community, or is it a power that they have themselves to initiate an action from their own perspective with no community input into a breach arising?
So I understand from the legislation, I'm absolutely willing to be corrected, that it would be a report would be made to the Land and Communities Commissioner, and on the face of the bill it says what the content of that report should look like and how that should be reported to the Commissioner. So there's a set process on the face of the bill, but only as things currently stand, a community with a registered interest in land within the terms of the land management plan could report a potential breach. Historic Environment Scotland, a local authority within which the land sits, SEPA and SNH. So this would be extending it out, and there's a set process on the face of the bill, which we can look at separately, whether that is appropriate or not, but it's whether those who can report a potential breach or allege a potential breach should be extended. So it's community councils, enterprise agencies, national park authorities and the Crofting Commission. If it's something you want to kind of digest and have a think about, that's fine, Mr Kirkwood. You don't need to kind of say just now, but there's an opportunity for witnesses to kind of what their gut tells them about extending it in that way. As long as Mr Overton just now.
I think that list added a number of, it's largely agencies that we're talking about here, then there's going to be due consideration given one assumes, and I suppose just the test of the validity of a complaint it's important that is clear. So I suppose the question that comes to mind is vexatious complaints, if you like, or challenges, which, I mean, our business is a small business, I think, in terms of how you would measure it in UK average. It's large within the community within which it sits, but our ability to deal with complaints that weren't fully formed is limited. So I think that for me would be the key element, that the Commissioner has a good test against which to check any issues that would be raised. These agencies, if they're going to raise it, then there's presumably something one would assume serious amiss. And in that case, I suppose they have the right. They should have, the right to be able to do that. Those would be my two thoughts.
I hate paraphrasing what witnesses are saying, but Mr Overton, you're basically saying if potentially vexatious complaints can be weeded out by the Commissioner ahead of an investigatory process, so that doesn't have to happen if not required, then you'd be content with the list being amended as suggested by the Land Commission.
Yes.
Okay. I'm not trying to kind of put words in your mouth. I just want to kind of be clear. But is it one of our witnesses online? Perhaps Megan McInnes. What's your views?
Thank you. Yes. I think, in general, from the perspective of a community group and a community member living in an area of concentrated land ownership, we were concerned about the narrowness of the types of bodies that were able to report a breach in the draft bill, and we welcome the recommendation that this be broadened out from the Scottish Land Committee. There are two reasons for this. One is that the Applecross Community Company is one of the few LRA compliant bodies in the area, and so I think by restricting that, restricting community groups to have to be LRA compliant, that causes unnecessary limits on who's able to register a report a breach. But the more important context is that, and I think it's really important that committee members have a clear understanding of this, that in places of concentrated ownership, this means that local community groups may not feel comfortable reporting a breach because the jobs and the homes of the volunteers involved in those groups are dependent on that concentrated, that land owner. And there is therefore it places community members in a very awkward position if they're having to, if they're the ones that are needing to be relied on to report a breach. I think it could be argued that local authorities and other statutory bodies may have other higher level priorities than kind of undertaking the investigations needed for them to be able to consider to report a breach or not. So we think it's really important that the number of bodies be extended. We also agree with the Commission's recommendation that the Land and Communities Commissioner should be able to proactively investigate the breach themselves. Another part of this that we think is really important, that reports of breaches need to remain anonymous in order for there not to be any adverse impacts on the individuals involved, particularly in areas of concentrated land ownership where there are problems which are leading to the need for a report of a breach in the first place. Thank you.
That's helpful. You've kind of moved on to where I was going to take the line of questioning. But before we come on to that, can I just check, do other witnesses have a different view in relation to the adding of these 4 organisations, just so we can put it on the record at this point in time? Okay. Mr Titwood, yeah.
These 4 organisations may already have statutory regulatory powers in connection with a breach. And I think there's a point here that part of this, this legislation across the board is adding another layer of legislation and rights to legislation that's already enacted elsewhere, which gives powers. And I think I have a concern that we're adding another layer of legislation in places where there's existing legislation which deals with the problems anyway. And that's something to be sensitive and aware of.
Okay, now, that's helpful. And maybe actually come back to the anonymity question raised by Megan in a moment, but it's more about the role of the Land and Communities Commissioner, that proactive role to investigate potential breaches. And I'll stick with yourself, Mr Kirkwood, because I've suggested to witnesses before that I would quite like the Land and Communities Commissioner to be able to pick a random sample of land management plans and do a bit of digging just to see whether they are compliant or not, to catch landowners out, but like Mr Overton was talking about, the Land Commission having a forum about what a good land management plan looks like and how landowners can be supported to produce that. But if we are going to drive up standards and share best practice, then there has to be more of a proactive role, I think, for the Land and Communities Commissioner. I suppose, Mr Kirkwood, how would you feel about the proactive powers of the Land and Communities Commissioner to investigate potential breaches, but more generally just dipping their toe in the water to find out what's happening out there across Scotland with land management plans more generally? What's your thoughts on that, Mr Kirkwood?
I think if there's a statutory obligation to put in place a land management plan and it's proportionate, and the requirement to engage on developing that plan is proportionate and reasonable too, my gut feeling is there should be a similar obligation upon the community to produce an LPP. I don't know if that can be a statutory obligation, but clearly to have an LPP in place, working in tandem and cooperation with a land management plan will, I think, deliver a lot of the benefits that this legislation is seeking to deliver. So the two together, I think, are a good thing. And then in terms of delivery and performance, yes, there probably should be some kind of overall governance and ability to question what's going on. But again, it should be proportionate and appropriate. This legislation is brought forward on the basis that scale and extent of land ownership is the problem, if you like, and that's linked to control. And I think that's a starting position which itself is open to fundamental question. Certainly in terms of wildland, the scale of land ownership is really a side effect of the overall ambition of conservation at scale over a long period for nature outcomes.
On that, Mr Kirkwood, I apologise for
maybe I'm digressing, but I was trying to make the point in terms of land management plans, enforcement and control. There's an element of proportionality and what is it trying to achieve?
Absolutely. The Convener will be quite terse with me if I don't stay focused on the questions, Mr Howard.
If the compliance or the regulation of compliance is put on a statutory footing, I think one of the potential risks, particularly about compliance of the performance of the what's the content of the land management plan, setting aside the need to prepare a land management plan in the first place, then I think there's a real risk that that will curtail ambitions of what's in the land management plan itself. And you'll go back to a point I made some while ago, is that anybody preparing a land management plan may be tempted to stick to not the bare minimum, but what they're required to do to meet compliance, to avoid the suggestion later that they might be upbraided for not having met some of the targets or aspirations that are set out in their land management plan. To deal with your second point, if the proactive function of the Land and Communities Commissioner could act in the same way that the role of the Tenant Farming Commissioner has been discharged to date, then I think that would be helpful, because what you would see is that particular individual starting a process of dialogue between the complainant and the land manager, because the compliance failure may be either inadvertent or out with their control, and it may be something that should and can be resolved without the need for anybody to get big sticks out. If I could just put one further thing on record, I mean, I don't know Applecross at all. I'd just like it to be, I mean, I've worked in land management for, 30 years. I've never experienced any shortage of enthusiasm for expressing a view from local communities, whether they live or are adjacent to the estates that I've managed, in providing that feedback. I have not witnessed a fear factor. People are usually incredibly candid, whether they want to say something good or they've got a complaint to make. And, we encourage that.
It may just be worth putting on the, thank you for that, Mr. Howard, worth putting on the record, Convener, that we have heard from some witnesses in private, because they were concerned about airing their views in public. But I get every landowner is different, and every tenant is different, every community group is different. But we have heard some of that. I think that's important to put on the record, Convener. So not everyone's had an opportunity to speak, but I'll put in my final question, and we can maybe mop this up, because Megan also spoke about anonymity for those complaining because of that potential risk, Mr. Howard, that we have heard about. So feel free to comment on the first two questions, but in relation to anonymity, if I could say the word anonymity, perhaps Laura, do you have a view on that?
Yes, it just reminds me of the situation with the Crofting Commission, and at the moment it's crofters, grazings committees and landowners that can report any crofting violations, and the upshot of that is that it doesn't really happen. Like, people don't do it. It's certainly something that I've heard a lot of in the Northwest region, is that people are reluctant to come forward and make those kind of reports. And I can absolutely see how it would apply to this as well.
Okay, thank you. Danny, I don't think you've had opportunity to comment during this section of questions. Anything you'd want to put on the record in relation to the questions asked?
Yes, please. On Colonsay, there are issues where anonymity would help. There are people who come to us and don't want to be on the record because they're housed or paid for by a particular party. So I think it would help if, at the very least, community councils were included in because that gives people a route to make a personal approach.
It gives a degree of protection behind the community organisation to report
on their behalf. Yeah,
I suppose that. Now, I don't have any further questions. I just want to make sure: is there anything the witnesses in this section feel they should have put on the record that they've not been able to? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, and I think the evidence from Laura is quite interesting there. I think that there's plenty of examples of where crofters have complained against each other and started probably the equivalent of the next Third World War in the crofting community, and certainly the crofting legislation, which allows the common grazings and people to report people not attending, has caused a certain amount of angst, I think would be a fair description. Douglas, you wanted to ask a question briefly, and then I'm going to have a break before we go into the next point.
Yes, thank you, Convener. It's just a brief question on the land management plans. We've had evidence previously about whether the land management plan should transfer, if there was transfer of ownership, whether the land management plan would actually be required to be met by the new owners. Have you got any sort of views on that, whether the LMP should actually be transferred with ownership, or whether that would even be legal? Tim?
Answer that. I mean, I think talking of wildland, where the land management plan would be related to management of land at scale for long-term objectives in nature conservation and recovery. If a small area was disposed of then the relevance of that land management plan for that small area would probably be irrelevant, because the outcome sought probably couldn't be achieved in the way that the current estate and management can deliver. So other parts of the bill deal with transfers and the appropriateness of new owners and community interest and delivery of the bill. You know, that interfaces on all of this. But my answer to your question, look, for Wildland, I can't see the land management plan that applies to a significant area of ground being of any value or relevance to a small-scale disposal.
Dennis?
I think even, and it's a theoretical response because I don't see it cropping up in our own situation, but the idea of it being a compulsory element of acquiring a piece of land, whatever size, that the new owner has a requirement to operate that in exactly the same way as the predecessor would be a very unusual piece of required activity, particularly legislatively required. So the practicalities of it, I think I would see very difficult. I think it would have a very sort of chilling effect on the land market.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Danny?
I don't know the legalities of it, but it would seem logical to me that a land management plan goes with the land. It's about managing that particular land. If that's passed to someone else, the onus would be on them to change the management plan that they've inherited.
And I guess there's complications of how that would be done. And sorry, Andrew, maybe last on this?
Yes, if I understand Danny correctly, I think logically the new owner would require to review or to produce a new LMP, because they may have slightly different or quite different but perfectly valid management objectives that they wish to set out.
But I guess if that plan was agreed with the community, then they would have to almost start the whole process again. And how do you take that views with them?
Well, I think they would need to sit down with the community and prepare that plan. I mean, I've already made my views clear on the merits of LMPs, but and that's why, in a way, to sound like a broken record, an LPP, which is a community-driven process, is probably more appropriate.
Mm-hmm. And if I can just bring Megan in briefly.
Thank you, Douglas. Yes, I just wanted to come back on this question about whether or not it would be legal for land management plans to be transferred over. I mean, I am not a lawyer, but it seems to me that there are already precedents in existing systems where burdens on a piece of land are transferred to a new owner. We can see this very clearly in terms of the way that crofting assignations are applied and the continued burdens on crofting land. And you can also see that in terms of long-term management plans for forestry being transferred over as a piece of forestry changes hands. And many of, for example, the burdens that are introduced when a piece of woodland is registered in the Woodland Carbon Code includes burdens which are placed on that land itself rather than on the owner. So I think that it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to consider land management plans to be in the same model of those. I just had a question for the convener. I wanted to make a point about land management plans in terms of the sanctions and what happens should a breach be investigated. Is this going to be a point I can make now, or are we returning to this topic after the break?
We are not returning to this topic. So a very well-engineered way of getting yourself in, Megan, but only if you're brief.
I will be very brief, I promise. I really just wanted to kind of connect the proposed maximum sanction of £5,000 as proposed with the bill to the conversation we were having earlier about best value of costs of community consultation and charrettes, because it seems as though the best value route for some landowners may just to be ignored, the best value route may be to ignore the requirement to develop a land management plan if they will only be fined £5,000. There are a number of So as a result of that, we think that what's in the bill is not very appropriate and would not be an adequate deterrent we are in support of some of the proposals in the Land Commission's most recent recommendations around the possibility of cross-compliance measures being introduced as well. The other thing that, from the community perspective, we think is important is that the scope of the breaches be clarified to be extended to not just cover if a land management plan has been developed and published, but also if it has been implemented. And so those were the various points I just wanted to put on the record at this stage in relation to land management plans. Thank you, Convener, for this chance to do this before the break.
Well done, Megan, for getting it in. Just the issue of management plans transferring with ownership. I think there's an estate up for sale in the Highlands with Jeremy Leggett selling with a management plan in place. And one of the requirements is that you have to buy it with that management plan. I don't think he's found a buyer yet. I might be wrong, but it might stop. And my question is very briefly to Tim. It might stop people acquiring estates to reach the Scottish Government's net zero targets if they're not allowed to change what's happening on that estate for a period of time. Might it or might it not?
Yeah, I think that's a very real risk. I think a new owner coming in will have their own aspirations. They'll be aware of the legislation once this is enacted, and they will need to comply with that, and they'd need to bring their own management objectives and forwards through whatever the statutory process is at the time. But I think to take on an obligation that's been imposed by a previous manager with their own aspects and objectives, if it was a legally binding thing, will affect value and could have the effect that you say. And we're working in a fast-changing world. We need to have rapid and appropriate and solutions at scale. And to take on a property that isn't best equipped with respect to that could be seriously detrimental.
Thank you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to suspend the meeting literally till 11:05, just to allow people to stretch their legs before we go on to the final run of questions. Thank you. So let's suspend the meeting. Thank you and welcome back to this meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. The next questions will come from the Deputy Convener, Michael.
Yes, you'll be aware that the proposed 1,000 hectare threshold for the prohibiting and notification of land transfer levels has been set out in the bill. Do you think that the level which has been set at is the appropriate level for advance notification? Who wants to get us started there? Mr. On.
Hello. Just something I put in my statement that I submitted to you earlier, which I said that the threshold should not be, I think I said increased, but what I meant was it shouldn't be weakened. From a community, Colonsay community perspective, the threshold is fine because it captures what it needs to capture, but I can see the merits in it being reduced so that more smaller communities or communities affected by smaller amounts of land are brought within the scope of the legislation.
Okay. Mr. Howard, you put your hand up.
Yeah, I'll repeat something I said a few minutes ago, and that having any threshold is illogical because it doesn't address the nature of the land or the site or the asset that's of interest to communities across Scotland. So you'll end up with some communities that have rights and some communities that don't. So you either think these things are a good idea, in which case they should apply to everybody, or you think that they're a bad idea and they shouldn't apply to anybody. Now, personally, I think the prior notification proposals and lotting are a bad idea, but I'm sure we'll come on to that. But if we're dealing with the issue of thresholds, then it's illogical because you could have an owner with, as I said earlier, 20 hectares, but that owner may own all the land within or around a settlement, and they're not covered by these arrangements. You could have somebody with 1,000 hectares, which is kilometres away from a community with no assets that are of interest to anybody in the area, and they're covered. So it's illogical.
So can I just clarify then, is your view is that there should be no threshold set in having the for prohibiting or notifying land transfer?
No, I'm saying there should be no prior notification or lotting provisions, and I'm sure we'll come on to that. But if you were to have prior notification and lotting, then I see no logic in having a threshold.
So let's work on the basis that we're going to have it. What do you think it should be? None at all. It should be just no threshold.
Well, you're going to have.
I understand your point is that you think there shouldn't be, but what I'm saying is let's work on the basis that there is going to be.
Okay, well in that case I think that some of the recent communication from the Scottish Land Commission is probably helpful because they've started to identify assets or a de minimis scale of assets that they think shouldn't be covered by prior notification. Because if you logically included everything, then you're going to have a massive bureaucratic burden for 99.9% of assets being disposed of, which aren't going to be of interest to or not taken forward by communities. So I think there's a range of assets that shouldn't be included in the prior notification arrangements. So that might be small additional plots of land being added to homes, somebody getting a garden extension, that sort of thing, individual homes, development sites where the planning permission is already in place. So under these arrangements, every development transfer or land transfer in Torna Grain will need to go through the prior notification process. We've set up a house building subsidiary. Every individual house sale from that house building subsidiary would need to go through prior notification. I don't think that can really have been the intention of the Bill team when they proposed this. So I think a careful examination of the exemptions that would need to be put in place to avoid having excessive bureaucracy and getting in the way of transactions which are highly unlikely to be of interest to local communities.
Okay, so remove the threshold and go for an exemptions process.
Well, that would be more logical than having a threshold, but that's not going to make me very popular with landowners less than 1,000 hectares around the country. But you've asked me for an opinion, so I'm giving you an opinion on logic.
I'm grateful for that. Mr. Overton.
So I think there is obviously an arbitrary nature in these thresholds. I think of more interest to me on this point, if I may, is on the whole question of prior notification in the bill, when in the 2003 Act there does seem to be a mechanism set out in terms of community right to buy, which is now under review. I saw the Cabinet Secretary setting out a review process of that last summer. And if that is not working in some shape or form, I wonder why that is not being resolved, first of all, before layering this prior notification process onto the statute book. So my question is more about why this is the necessity of this within the bill, and particularly when we've got a review underway on this whole question of the efficiency of community right to buy.
So notwithstanding the review that's been undertaken at the present moment, is it your position that the existing land reform legislation deals with this sufficiently without the need for further legislation in this area?
Theoretically, it does, but it would appear that elements of it are not working. So a review is underway, which is, in my view, the right way of doing this, and it may mean that this prior notification requirement of this bill is therefore unnecessary.
Mr. Owen, would it make a difference in your community if, given you've got significant landowners, that I take from your comment you've very limited engagement with, or they're not overly proactive in engaging with the community, that this type of prior notification would be a valuable thing to a development company like your own?
It would be a valuable thing. I don't think... I can understand the point about exemptions, excuse me, but I'm sorry, I've lost a little bit of the question again. Could you just...
Yeah, it's just whether you think the prior notification process has been set out in the bill, whether you think that would be a helpful thing for a community-based development company like your own, given the nature of the relationship that you have with your existing landowners?
I think it would be a help, yes. I'm not sure what role we have in being consulted on that. But the fact that there can be an obligation to let people know, let the community know, let the Commissioner know, whoever, must be of a benefit, because we are in the dark on so many things.
Okay. I don't know if any of our colleagues online... if I go to Mr Kirkwood, then I'll come to Lord Agriconis.
I think that this part of the proposed legislation, the bill of prior notification, appeared at the point of the bill being published. I don't think there had been much consultation or engagement prior to that on this matter. I echo what Dennis says, that there is existing legislation which is currently undergoing review, and I'd pick up on the point that I made earlier when in dealing with Bob. I think there was a risk of stacking legislation on top of legislation here and doubling up where it's not necessary. The fact of putting an area test or measurement on the aspect, again, is predicated on the notion that concentration of power is a function of scale of land ownership, and this depends on many more factors than just area. I think each case is pretty much unique, so that has to be borne in mind. You said earlier, if one accepts that there is going to be a threshold, if the bill goes through and it's all procedurally correct and right, if there is going to be one, then I think 1,000 hectares is probably one that we would concede on the basis that it's probably better than a smaller one, and having a lower threshold is just going to bring forward many more cases. The administrative burden, cost, time and impact of that for probably no worthwhile outcome. So that would be my view.
Yeah, I think the tension here is whether you have a threshold or not, and if you don't have a threshold, do you introduce an exemption regime instead, rather than setting what some may argue is an arbitrary threshold of 1,000 hectares. So can I just clarify, do you have an objection in principle to the idea of the prior notification process?
Well, there is already a prior notification process. I think that the concern is that there's a perception that a private off-market sale is not caught by the existing legislation. But it is. If a community has registered an interest in land through the statutory process that's available to them, even at any point the landowner wishes to sell, even if it's private, then he needs to declare that, and the community has the right to intercede. So I'm just questioning whether it's necessary to have a further layer of regulation and statute in place for powers that are currently there and are currently under review in any event.
And if they haven't registered an interest?
If they haven't registered an interest, there is I'm not an expert, I believe there is a route to registering under an emergency procedure anyway in the existing statute, I believe.
30 days.
Yeah. So, this is somehow leading by the communities by the nose. It's almost flagging it up. This is happening. Surely you should be interceding. It's a sort of, it's a prodding measure, adding to that imperative where I think there's existing statute which deals with this anyway.
Okay. Murag McInnes. Sorry, Megan. Sorry, Megan.
No, that's
Apologies.
fine. Thank you. I wanted to just talk about the thresholds first and then get on to the question of prior notification and the community right to buy, because there's quite a lot of questions in here. So if I don't answer all of your questions, please let me know. On the question of the thresholds for any of the introductions, any of the measures which are introduced by this bill, we would agree there is a certain arbitrary nature in this, but nevertheless it is important to have a threshold to start with. There was a lot of complexity and lack of clarity in the bill at the moment with the various different thresholds. So having a single threshold where these measures come into force is really important. However, if we're thinking about sort of maximising the scope and the impact of the bill and what it's trying to achieve, then it is really important to think about the broader local context. And that's why some of the evidence that's been given by other people to your committee previously around the importance of having concepts such as the public interest placed at the centre of the bill would help to achieve that. Also, the concept of making sure that decisions are made based around sites of community significance, if that's what we're calling them, as being identified through the various different processes, land management plans and local place plan and other action plans of development trusts. Given the fact that thresholds are relatively arbitrary, one measure which could help in all of this is to regularly review and, if possible, if necessary, amend the thresholds at which these measures come into force. But the other question, in my mind, reading through the bill and looking at and understanding the local context near us is what can be done to address any potential loopholes which are being introduced by this bill through the use of the thresholds as the way of deciding who is responsible for the obligations and who is not. And there are a couple of loopholes in our view, which I just wanted to bring to the committee's attention. One is around the fact that the bill does not currently include aggregate holdings, which we think creates an opportunity for land ownership, which is in fact at scale not being included in the measures in this bill because it's registered under different companies. The other is the way in which contiguous land holdings, for example, land which is severed by railways and roads, will be excluded. So these are some loopholes which we think could be addressed relatively straightforwardly in the bill and could help to address some of these potential loopholes. I wanted just to, then go on to saying a little bit about the prior notification. From our perspective, there is absolutely a need for increased transparency and disclosure around potential sales of large land holdings. This is in response to the large number of recent trend we've seen in land sales, with an increase in off-market sales. And we regularly hear from community groups across the Highlands who are caught by surprise about an estate on or near where they live suddenly changing hands with no information available. One of the other panellists mentioned the fact that communities already have an ability to register an interest in a piece of land, and this is correct, but not all communities have done that. And particularly, for example, in our case, where the ownership of land on the Applecross estate hasn't changed hand for more than 150 years, not all communities are prioritise registering an interest in that land. So we think that the prior notification measures are really important. However, we don't think what is proposed in the bill will work at the moment in terms of the burden of being notified of a forthcoming sale being placed on the community body, in terms of having to register and be a Land Reform Act compliant body. And we did like what was included in the recent Land Commission recommendations, where the disclosure of forthcoming sales is based on measures already in place for planning and crofting regulations, in terms of notifications being made available to local community council and published in the local media, for example. That seems a much more straightforward and light touch approach than what was being suggested in terms of a new register being created. I did also want to just say something about the connections between this bill and the wider community right to buy. We would agree with the other panellists that it is unfortunate that the wider review of the community right to buy mechanisms is still underway. It hasn't been complete yet. Ideally, the sequencing would be that wider review had been completed first before the measures of this bill are connected to it, because there are some fundamental elements of this bill which rely on the existing community right to buy regulations and measures. And from our perspective, and from the perspective of other community landowners, the review into the wider review into the community right to buy mechanisms is urgently needed. There are some really significant challenges which are preventing community groups from taking up those rights and working through those various different routes existing in the right to buy. And this land reform bill is weakened by its dependence on those mechanisms, when there are some well-documented flaws and ways in which the existing measures could need to be improved in order for them to function and deliver what they're trying to deliver in terms of improving land ownership across Scotland. So there is some questions about the sequencing of that, which we think needs to be considered. I also wanted to touch on the Land Commission's recommendations around de minimis exclusions.
Megan, with respect, I'm going to have to let some of the other witnesses come in as well. I think you've had a fairly good run at it.
Okay, thanks, convener.
Could I just bring Laura in on that issue, because one hasn't. I mean, what the prior notification on a crofting estate, if somebody wants to buy their croft and wants to buy their apportionment or have the apportionment of their common grazings, and they want to tie that in, does that worry you, that you're going to have to go through the prior notification period? And it might add, if you go on the Scottish Land Commission's latest recommendations, 90 days to the process. Have you thought about that?
Not at all. I think I'd probably contact my solicitor.
Well,
it's not very complicated.
It could be an interesting point, because crofters have obviously the absolute right to buy their croft, and it could trigger this without exemptions. Anyway, the next questions then will come from Douglas Lumsden. Douglas.
Yeah, thanks, convener. And just building on a question you were just asking there about the Obviously, in the bill, we had a proposed two-phased prohibition period, which prohibits transfer, 30 days to express an interest and then 40 days to complete an application. Land Commissioner have now said maybe that should just be a single 90-day period to allow more time for communities to organise. I'm just trying to understand, is that something you would support, and is that still long enough for communities to basically to get their ducks in a row? Maybe, Laura, we can start with you.
I'm on. Sorry, could you repeat the beginning of the question, please?
Yes, in the bill there's a two-stage process that's proposed: 30 days to express an interest for community right to buy, and 40 days to complete an application. The Scottish Land Commission are proposing that change to just a 90-day process. Is that, is that long enough for communities to get everything organised that they need to?
Given our experience with Baden Tarbert, no. We started the EOI process in 2023, at the end of 23, and we were just responding to the initial feedback, and we'd done our initial petition. And there was that much kind of feedback that came back that we were busy trawling through it and dealing with it all when the estate came onto the market. And we were, at that point, we then had to get into the late application process, and were advised by the community land team in the Scottish Government that there'd been 39 applications since 2018. 4 of them were late applications and none of them were successful. So if we'd been going through that route and we didn't have a philanthropic donation, then we wouldn't have been able to complete the process. It's the level of detail that we would have needed to provide, we just couldn't within the time period that we had.
What time period do you think would be appropriate for communities?
It depends on the level of detail that we would need to provide, I think. Certainly going into the level of detail of providing evidence that the community wants to buy the land and what they want to do with it takes a lot of time. And it's so, like, yeah, you're asking me to put a length of time on it. Could we do it in 90 days? If we did nothing else, we could get it done in 90 days, I think.
And can I ask Megan as well, if you have a view on the timescales required?
Well, we haven't, the assets that we've purchased and the land we've purchased have been either through the community asset transfer or through a negotiated transfer. So we haven't the concrete experience that Laura have of those deadlines, but my understanding from the broad landowning sector is supports what Laura says in terms of the 30 and 40 day periods really not being adequate for what's happening at the moment. There are also delays in terms of the Section 34 letters, which needs to come back from the government confirming, compliance with the Land Reform Act. So I think that in some ways what's being proposed by the Land Commission in terms of that extension for 90 days would be helpful. The problem is it's difficult to separate this out from some of the wider issues in relation to the community right to buy mechanisms, which are the scope of the wider review that's happening in parallel to this. One of the ways I think which would be very helpful to move this all forward is for the bill to consider the proposal that's being made by a number of different groups, including the Land Commission, of communities being able to proactively designate sites as sites of community significance, because this would help there already being public knowledge of the areas that the communities are interested in. So that would be a helpful way of moving it forward, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else got a view on that? Andrew?
I think as a general principle, it would be better if you can identify the areas, and Megan's just called them areas of community significance. I think that's fine. If you can identify those in advance, because if you're going to have an intervention, you want to make it as least bureaucratically burdensome and have the least detrimental impact on the land market as you can, whilst meeting the objective of facilitating communities' aspirations to acquire land. So I think the best way to do that is to enhance support for the local place plan process, because that's the best vehicle to identify those areas of community significance, and clearly review the existing rights that you've got in statute so that they are more flexible, more fit for purpose. Yeah. That way, it would then be increasingly likely that if somebody was making a disposal of land, they would know in advance that that was an issue, that area of community significance had been identified, and they could open discussions with the community group as a part of that sales process. If you're waiting until the moment that that person decides that they're going to sell, then the disruptive effects of that are very significant, whether that be through the lotting process or whether it be through all the bureaucracy associated with prior notification and potentially trapping sales in that, bogging down, for instance, the individual sale of a house that we've built at Torna Grain for 90 days, whilst, the community aren't going to come forward and say, well, we want to buy the house. So what on earth is the point of trying to capture things like that? It's better to work to identify those areas of community significance first, and then everybody knows where they stand.
So are you fearful that that 90 days could just be used as a tool by some people to sort of delay sales of certain pieces of land?
I'm not sure that there would be a malicious element to this. I think it's just that it would be a natural part of the process of creating this potential opportunity. I mean, every time we, for instance, took a house that we built to the market, the purchaser looking at it will say, well, I've now got to wait for 90 days to work out whether we've been through this sort of process. So there's 3 months they're sitting waiting, and they just want to buy their house. Well, that's going to make any houses that we build much less attractive to somebody than a house built by a housing developer who isn't caught by some arbitrary threshold. So I think it's important you don't have interventions like that where sellers can get caught at the last minute. You should work to reform existing processes so that you can understand where communities have an interest in acquiring.
But I guess there could be exemptions put in place to avoid that sort of scenario.
Well, that would obviously be helpful, and I'm pleased that the SLC started to look at that. Yeah.
And Danny?
Yeah, there's not much I can disagree with that. We're not in a position we've not looked at. We don't have the resources to consider any right to buy registration at the moment. We're told it's complex. We're told that late registrations can be frustrated and can fail. But I think there has to be something there to take account of the fact that there might be a transfer that no one was aware of. And as long as possible and as many resources as possible to small communities would be really helpful. But I do understand the point. To me, just looking at the changes that are proposed to the Land Reform Act, it does seem to suggest that that little bit of extra time could make a big difference, extending it slightly. But that's not from experience. It's just...
Okay, Tim, do you want to come in?
Yeah, given that there's likely to be an obligation to produce a land management plan through community consultation and a clear aspiration that communities will pick up and put in place local place plans, and the two should marry together, then a local community should be in a position to identify assets that they think are important to the sustainable development of the community in the long term, should they come to the market. And there is the existing legislation there to register an interest in those assets, and that would catch a private sale the way we discussed earlier. So I go back to what I said before. If you look at the potential statute as a whole, I think there's a lot in there that solves the problems that we're discussing just now. If they are put in place, and to add a further level of statute with respect to the right to buy, I think would be unnecessary if the statute is properly constructed and put together.
So do you feel that the government should remove the community right to buy section from this bill and just concentrate on getting the community right to buy that they're already undertaking a review?
Well, yeah, there is a review, and the timing, as said earlier, is not that helpful. I think the review for the existing statute needs to be completed, and then this legislation constructed to make use of that, so the two run together in a proper way without adding more legislation and the scenario for confusion and difficulty.
Danny, did you want to come back on that point briefly? Or?
I recognise a smile.
That's in your face.
It's not unusual for legislation to amend existing legislation. It's a simple, seems to be a fairly straightforward and simple process. So if it's something that needs doing, it could be done now for good reason, even in advance of a review of the earlier legislation.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Okay, I'm just thinking that through to pass legislation which might get amended doesn't sort of work for me as a politician, but I'm sure it works for some other people. And on that note, I'll move to Mark for his questions. Mark.
Yes, I wanted to ask your reflections on lotting decisions. And Megan, I think earlier on you were mentioning about the Land Commission's proposals to put the public interest, I guess, at the heart of the bill. And I think you mentioned, the lotting decisions as being one area where, public interest could come in. So look, I'll maybe start with yourself, and then I'm sure others will have views as well.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, I mean, I think in general, the concept of the lotting decisions has the potential to increase diversity of land ownership in Scotland and bring specific sites of community significance into community ownership for community benefit. And based on that, it's something that we very much would agree with. It's in line with the way that we've approached the acquisition of small sites of land in Applecross for delivering community benefit activities on. However, I think that there are some things in the bill which will limit its impact at the moment in the way it's framed. One of them is by focusing on the tests and lotting decisions being based around this concept of community sustainability rather than a broader public interest measure. And the reason for this is that the concept of community sustainability doesn't really have a recognised term in Scottish law as far as I'm aware, as we are aware, whereas public interest is a tried and tested measure. It's already in place across various pieces of Scottish and UK legislation. So that would be one reason. The other reason is obviously that all of this is potential. There's the question of the extent to which any of this is interfering with property rights as protected under the European Convention of Human Rights, Article 1, Protocol 1, and that A1, the Article 1, Protocol 1 element of ECHR provides the rationale and legal basis for governments to interfere with property rights is based around a public interest argument. So if you use the public interest as the basis of, what's called a transfer test or a lotting test, a transfer test or a public interest test, and then lotting decisions that are made subsequently, then you have a much stronger basis when it comes to the space within which the government can act based on a public interest argument. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, thanks for that. Dennis, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, thank you. If I could. So just first of all, a reflection in terms of our own experience and trying to imagine how this would work out in practice. I think our objective is to be meeting community demands, and if there is a land that the community is interested in, then there should be that process of discussion and negotiation already. So to me, there's an element of this feeling somewhat theoretical. I think in our own community we've seen that there's not interest in managing land at scale, so there has been the opportunity to have community purchase. The community decided not, when it came to a vote, not to go down that route. So that's my kind of context in terms of coming to this. This is a big change, I think, and it raises some very big questions. Megan's referred to some of those in terms of the way in which the land market works. I think that the reading through the proposals in the bill, which is something I don't do regularly. I found it very difficult to follow the proposals. I was surprised by the number of referrals to powers being given to ministers rather than the information as to how this would work in practice being set on the face of the bill. I was interested then to see the report from the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee last week, which was making a similar point, that there's a lot of delegated powers in the way that this is set out. So it makes it quite difficult for me to respond in a way that I am clearly understanding how this process, quite complicated process of lotting as it's set out in the bill, is actually going to work. And I see that committee is suggesting that 14 of those proposed use of delegated powers out of 50 that are in the bill, they're questioning that. I think I might question a slightly higher number than that. So it's hard to understand how lotting, how this process is actually going to work. And I think that's wrong in terms of trying to consider the impact of legislation when it's such a major change in the way that land is transferred, is being proposed here. If such a process does come into being, then I think the public interest test is absolutely critical, and that should certainly be on the face of the bill, in my view, so that we can understand very clearly what the circumstances would be that would have this lotting process come into play.
Can I just ask you, I mean, do you think that's a problem then, that there isn't a public interest test currently within the bill when it comes to transfer? You know, there's a transfer test that's applied to the seller.
So we have.
But there isn't really anything applied to the purchaser as a public interest test.
So I think public interest being the reason for ministers deciding to go down the route of lotting is the point I'm making. And I think that if that were clear, if that were the reason, rather than this rather vague statement around community development, that's vague. And what we need, I think, public interest is more clearly understood, as Megan's mentioned already. And that would be the starting point. So much greater clarity in terms of what would stimulate a lotting decision by ministers. So I find it hard to be definitive, partly because it's so unclear to me as to how this would work, and the level of powers given to ministers after the passage of this legislation, if it passes as it's set out today. I would have a lot of questions and concerns about that.
Yeah, thanks for highlighting DPLR's consideration of it as well. Andrew, I sense that you probably want to come in on this. I think you've
thank you.
Getting your thoughts on the public interest aspect of it.
I won't go over again what I said to Mr Lumsden about it being definitely preferable to have identified the assets that might be of interest to the community in advance, because then that has the least disruptive intervention. Because if you've got to the point that somebody's decided to dispose of their property and then the whole process comes to a grinding halt, well, it would have been better to know that you'd got that. You'd identified what might be of interest to community in advance. It's not been mentioned, but I think banks will be interested in anything that delays the potential sale of properties if they've got securities. So our experience of banks is they like securities over assets that they know will sell quickly if they have to call them in. Well, if that happens to be a land holding over a particular threshold, then they may become concerned that they could potentially get dragged into a delayed process of disposal should they wish to dispose of that. So I imagine the committee's probably, or the bill team, have taken evidence from banks, but I think that would be helpful. Certainly ours raised an eyebrow when we took him through it. And as Dennis has said, I think it would be helpful to understand a little bit more about public interest, because it is at the back of all this, whether it's called community development or community wealth building, it's deemed to be in the public interest. Well, my understanding of the legal position is the public interest is pretty much whatever the government thinks it is. And that's certainly come through in previous ECHR cases. I think it would be helpful if the bill was clearer about what the long-term outcomes of this bill is. If it's diversity of land ownership, well, fine, but I don't see that as an end in itself. I see the delivery of all those other benefits, whether it be agricultural, forestry, net biodiversity, carbon reduction, all that sort of thing, are really the objectives that government should be looking to achieve. And some of those will be more readily and more easily delivered at scale. So sometimes diversity of land ownership won't always fit with the most effective delivery of some of the government's other wider objectives. But overall, the important thing to do would be to have the least impact in by identifying what you want in advance rather than catching it at the last minute.
Okay, Tim?
Yeah, got some concerns here. The lotting applies to the transfer of the land, so I don't think it's just the sale of the land. It could be the transfer, and a lot of the aspects of this legislation and the bill depend on secondary legislation yet to come forwards to define a lot of the definitions and the mechanisms within the bill. So a lot of this isn't on the face of the bill. It's dependent upon secondary legislation, which makes interpretation and assessment of the overall impact for any party relating to this bill difficult to define, I think, anyway, as a general point. But it appears that a transfer could be things other than the sale anyway, so that's a concern. There's also reference to fair value within the bill. Don't really know what fair value is in terms of the bill and the intent here. There are other definitions of value, market value, which are clearly understood. There are other definitions of value in the Community Right to Buy in the Land Reform Bill, and set criteria as to how value is to be defined there, relating to the impact on the residue of the holding and the like. So the complexities around that, which would need to be understood. And the public interest test, I think, is absolutely essential here, in that there are policy objectives in the bill which go beyond making ownership of land more accessible. There are several other policy objectives there, and I think they should be worked into the public interest test that would be applied to any lotting decision. I think that's essential. I think those are the points that I want to make with respect to that.
Okay. Anyone else want to come in? Laura, Danny?
We'll go on to the next question then.
So, I mean, related to that, then, I did want to ask you about your views on the transfer test itself, which is being applied to a seller prior to sale rather than that public interest test at the point of transfer. If you've got any further points in relation to that, it'd be good to hear now.
Are you asking me?
Well, just any. I'm asking the panel.
Mark, could I ask you to try and limit this answer to two people? It's just that we are quite short of time, and I've been quite generous to everyone in what they've said, I think.
So, Megan, I don't know if you want to come back in on this aspect. You do, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, very quickly, this is another area that's unclear in the bill, as why the burden of assessment in the transfer test is on the seller, not the buyer. If the government's intention is to derive greater public good from land, then it's critical to know and consider what the intentions of the buyer are when approving a sale of a large landholding, as well as the seller. It's also easier to achieve given the ECHR restrictions, and I would point the committee to the research by James Muir KC, who looked into this. I'm sure this is something that you already have access to, but that would be another area where work could be done to improve the impact of the bill. Thank you.
Can I ask you, why do you think the government has gone down this particular route? Because I think the original consultation suggested a public interest test on the buyer rather than, this transfer test on the seller. So I'm curious as to whether you've got views or any of the panel got views as to why the government has gone down this route, why it rejected its original proposal.
I don't know, and I think the government has inadvertently made it actually more difficult to get this bill to work, because had they focused on what was originally consulted on, there would have been greater space for implementing this in terms of ECHR. So it's not clear why this route has been chosen.
Any other comments from the panel? No? Okay, back to you, convener.
Thanks very much, Mark. Kevin, you want a quick question before I move to...
A very quick question, convener, to Danny and to Megan, please. Both of you have highlighted difficulties that there have been with dominant landowners, tensions that have arisen. You've given comment around about large aspects of the bill. Is there anything else that you think that should be in the bill that would help your situations in your communities? And I'll go to Danny first, please.
Big question. There's a lot of things I could say, but I don't think we'll have the time for all of it. Is there anything else? Quickly.
Let's go to Megan then, please, and give you a wee bit of time, Danny, which puts you on the spot now, Megan.
Yes, I mean, I think that there are lots of parts of land reform which are needed, which are not touched on in this bill. So I'm assuming that we'll shortly be, considering future land reform bills in Parliament. I think in terms of so this bill does not address all of the areas of need. In terms of what is in the scope of this bill, I think the elements really are that have already been mentioned. There's this need for a greater range of groups who can, report a breach of the various different provisions, the requirement for anonymity. I think focusing on communities to be able to identify sites of community significance is really key. These are things I've already mentioned. So I think those are the key areas, and this focus on the public interest as the sort of measurement of assessment rather than less well-defined terms. I also think that what's really important is the broader community right to buy mechanisms, and making sure that that is reviewed, that is addressed in terms of legislative changes once the review is complete. That's also really essential for the committee to continue to consider. Thank you.
You, Danny?
Sorry, I'm just trying to read through all the notes. No, I don't think there's much to add. There's something I was going to mention about the opportunity to take local community views into account at the point of allotting decision. I don't know if that's adequately covered in the legislation. As to, we've talked a lot about local place plans and so on, helping to define best uses and informing the land management plans. But when it comes to lotting, how is that kind of approach and planning for the use of land, how is that taken into account in the lotting decision? And I think that should be something that ties the that kind of community aspiration into the face of the bill, as they call it, rather than being left as subordinate legislation. The mechanics of it could be left, but I just think that there's scope for that.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, convener.
Thank you. And Rhoda, now we come to you. You've been waiting very patiently.
It's been very interesting. Thank you. We heard from the community development companies really that they were looking for land to retain populations for community development, but this bill really looks at land at the moment of sale rather than ongoing development. And I wonder if there's something we could put in the bill to allow communities easier access to assets of community importance, such as compulsory purchase. Would that be a vehicle for doing that? And if so, who would have that power to do that? Or are there any other things that the community development companies would suggest that could go in the bill prior to the point of transfer or sale?
The community right to buy legislation does, I think, allow for compulsory purchase of, I think it's assets or land that's required for sustainable development. So is that not the solution rather than adding something in here? It also, I think, giving a small community, however well-intentioned and however skilled we might be at a particular point in time, giving them compulsory purchase rights is going to add a financial burden for all the help they'll need and make life quite difficult.
Could it be done through local authorities who already have those powers?
There's an example that we've had where the local authority resolved to take compulsory purchase to make an order, which persuaded the landowner to reach agreement on, it was rights rather than transfer or sale, rights over the land. So it can work, but in my experience of compulsory purchase, it's good to have it there because it can persuade the parties to come to agreement rather than having to go through a lengthy process, which would probably be beyond small communities.
Okay, and Megan?
Thank you, Rhoda. Yes, I think absolutely there is more that could be done in this bill in terms of making it easier for community development trusts like ourselves to acquire land to build affordable housing or respond to other urgent community needs, which would eventually help to retain population and sustain our communities in the long term. I think CPO powers could be interesting. I think also what would be worth considering by the committee is the proposal that was recently published by the Land Commission around ministers having an ability to make a fair market value offer to buy land holdings. While the processes in the bill are underway, I think this could really make a huge difference to communities who are wishing to acquire more land and assets, but are facing major challenges, such as the limits to funding. We're seeing restrictions in the Scottish Land Fund at the moment, and the simultaneous significant increase in land values, particularly in popular locations like Applecross, which are on the North Coast 500, where we've got 50% of the land, of the houses, for example, on our peninsula are second homes and short-term lets and are not available to local residents. So I think there's some work there that certainly is worth considering. There were also some elements to the lotting process, which I think could be strengthened in order to help communities take the best advantage of that. It's not clear, for example, what can be done to prevent one buyer from using the lotting process to subsequently buy all the lots of land through friends or family or holding companies. There also would need to be local contexts and sites of community significance considered within the lotting process to make sure that community groups have a chance to acquire those. There's a lack of clarity at the moment in those lotting decisions about how that would actually work. And that's why, again, I think embedding all of this within the sort of public interest test would be really critical. There are lots of other things that community groups are needing in order to be retaining population, such as continued access to rural and island housing fund in the long term, which are obviously, outside the scope of this bill, but I very much hope this is on the committee's radar, because obviously it's one thing to acquire a piece of land, it's quite another in the current market context and in the post-COVID sort of construction sector reality to be able to deliver affordable housing on that site. So that I think that the wider enabling factors which let community groups deliver these community benefits to their communities needs to also be taken into account. Thank you.
Andrew Howard as well, wanting to come in when you're ready.
Yes, I mean, I think it's been touched on by others, but I mean, the local authorities in particular would have compulsory powers to acquire if, for instance, there was a demonstrable housing need and land wasn't coming to the market to address that. local place plans, I think they're an excellent first rung on the planning ladder. I mean, before what was happening was that developers made their submissions, and that's how the first stage of the local plan process started. You've now got an opportunities for communities themselves to prepare their place plan for their community, and that engagement process with all the stakeholders, which will include the landowners as well, who will want to be part of that process because they'll want, like everybody else, to influence how that local place plan develops, is an opportunity perhaps to get greater clarity for all the parties about what communities want, and that may in itself release sites or at least develop a better understanding of what communities aspire to. And you quite rightly mentioned the need to retain populations and to even enhance housing opportunities. I've sat on a body with the Land Commission and also with Prosper, which used to be SCDI before they rebranded. And as Megan has suggested, it's clear that there are a whole range of problems which are limiting the development of housing, particularly in fragile areas, and that can be infrastructure, it can be Scottish Water, it can be planning, because some communities actually object to housing, and that can complicate things. There's environmental regs, and as Megan has suggested, you sometimes just can't get anybody to build them, and that's if you've sorted all the funding problems. So I think that it's right to look at whether compulsory purchase would work, but the powers probably exist already. Whether local authorities are using them all at the time, you know, when they could, I couldn't tell you, but I think the powers are there already.
Okay. Laura, did you have any comments to add?
I don't have anything more to add to that. I agree with Danny and Megan and their points. Absolutely, they're reflective of our situation.
Yeah.
A little point. I think the Scottish Land Commission recommends that public acquisition would only take place following a lotting decision, the way the bill is proposed at the moment. So that doesn't help with the risk of lotting for the transferor. The alternative would be if there's a public interest in the land being broken up, then this should apply before lotting. So it's a different phasing of the public interest test and the designation of the public interest in the land. If that happened, then ministers could identify the areas that are probably better in public ownership and could acquire them, and then that would leave the transferor free rein with the balance in the market. And that might work better than the sequencing that's currently in the bill.
And the sequencing is obviously on transfer of the land. I think some of the concerns lie with if the land isn't being transferred and there is a community development need for land, why wait until the land transfers? And I get that some landowners will enter into negotiations with communities, others will not. And it's how you make that happen for those that are in the difficult situation where the landowner won't enter into discussions with the community.
Mm-hmm.
I think I would agree in the sense of the comments that have been made around existing powers, particularly local authorities, especially with housing. But there may be other community areas of demand that are not being met that you're suggesting, that are compulsory purchase might not be so effective. But I'm wondering, are there areas beyond housing that you're thinking about?
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Any kind of community development. Housing is a very obvious one, but things like development of renewables to give an income to a community company, development of units for local businesses. There's a lot of things. The list is endless of what communities might want to develop. Okay. Can
I push you for your next question?
Yes.
Because we are just quite up against the clock because we've got to do our work programme discussion as well.
Yeah, I was wanting to turn to crofting, which is missing from the bill. And yeah, again, this morning we've heard a lot of discussion about crofting and its impact on land ownership. And I'm wondering, should crofting be specifically referred to in the bill? We heard before that crofters have an absolute right to buy individually, and should the crofting community right to buy reflect that to make it easier? And I'm looking at Laura really because you've just bought a crofting estate which is totally made up of crofting land. Should that not have been very easy to do given the existing powers of crofters?
As far as I understand it, the crofters have to set up some sort of vehicle or body that can make the purchase. And then, of course, there's the funding to actually make the purchase as well. So it's not an easy pathway by any means. And so in the case of Kayak, the most efficient option was to use the community development company because that was already compliant and able to make the purchase and hold the land. In the future, it's very possible that the townships could set up a body that would be able to take a transfer of land. Whether what form that took would be yet to be decided. So yes, I think as ever, crofting complicates things, and absolutely the bill has to take into account the existing rules and regulations and everything around crofting. Otherwise, it may create even more complication for communities and crofting communities to have to deal with.
Okay, but it could have been easier for the crofters if they individually exercised their right to buy, rather than having to go through the complexity of setting up a crofting community right to buy.
So do you mean purchasing their own crofts individually and apportionments, that kind of thing? Mm-hmm. Yes, I think many of them have done in the past. With the Baden Talbot estate, there's many crofts that have been purchased individually in the past, and so what the development companies bought here is what's left of the crofting estate.
But it was complex.
And I'm going to get a short question on at the end, because it's a yes or no answer. And just to give you fair warning, I'll be going in the reverse order as when I started. So it will be Megan, then Laura, Dennis, and so on. So the simple question is, the Cabinet Secretary, when she was outlining the three main aims of the Land Reform Bill as laid, was to give communities greater involvement in decisions, to promote more diverse ownership, to benefit environmental purposes, and a modern legalisation of the legal framework for tenant farming and small holdings. That was her aims. Does the bill as laid deliver it, yes or no? Megan?
Not yet.
No. Laura?
No.
No. Dennis?
Only in part.
That's on the fence answer.
Well,
no. No. Danny?
Every little helps.
Again, on the fence. It's a yes or no answer.
Well, I don't know about the third one, but the first two, yes.
OK. One yes. Tim?
No.
Andrew?
No.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of this session. Thank you very much for the time that you've given. Very helpful. Just to remind you, we are coming to the end of the evidence on this bill, but if there's anything that you want to feed in, and I think Laura and Megan were going to kindly feed in some ideas on costs of consultation, that would be very helpful. But if there's any other points that want to be fed in, that would be very helpful. I'm now going to suspend the meeting because we're going to move into private session. Thank you.